Good afternoon, my name is David Hotz, and I'll be doing a presentation balancing two principles, unilateral, non-colonial secession. Let's get started. So first, let's look at some of the key context behind UNC secession. Now, unilateral, non-colonial secession, what is it and why did I choose this policy as something to fix? So, unilateral non-colonial secession is defined as a process in which a separatist movement in a country decides to secede against the wishes of the parent state. This is an important question to answer because the legality of such a secession move is questionable in all circumstances thus far. However, it is different from unilateral colonial secession, which the UN does recognize the legality of, as the UN does not like the legacy of colonialism, especially when noting that the United States, the hegemon of the United Nations, was a former colony. The UN should determine the legality of such a right in order to better fall in line with its either territorial integrity or self-determinative principles, and also in order to increase international stability. So, why does the legal question of UNC secession remain unanswered? Well, it has a lot to do with the struggle between ideals of territorial integrity and self-determination. Article 1, subsection 2 of the UN Charter states that, quote, the purposes of the United Nations are to develop friendly relations amongst nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace, end quote. Article 2, subsection 4, on the other hand, states that, quote, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. These two principles run counter to each other, as the self-determination of people may lead to the territorial integrity of a state being threatened. The question has not been answered because the United Nations recognizes the possibility of negative impacts on geopolitical stability if the territorial integrity of states is constantly being threatened by internal separatist movements. Additionally, the only judicial ruling that has actually been made on the subject of UNC secession by the ICJ has been on Kosovan independence, where the UN deliberately avoided creating a precedent one way or the other, and it resulted in Kosovo being de facto independent, not de jure. No other cases have been brought to the to the ICJ, meaning that the legality of such a move remains unclear and that the UN still has power to determine the law on this issue pretty much unilaterally. So finally, for the purposes of international law, the only real recognition mechanisms are membership into the UN and domestic recognition from other countries. Therefore, the issue my solution will be focusing on is, how do we get these separatist nations into the UN? In order to inform the policy decision I want to create now, I have to look at the past interpretations and results of UNC secession and decide on a policy that falls in line with the way the United Nations has generally liked handling similar situations. While this list on screen is not exhaustive in describing every single case that is related to UNC secession, what can be seen on this slide is a list of every single case that had an impact on the formation of my policy. I identified all these cases as having fallen legitimately within the remedial rights-only philosophical framework, which I will explain in another slide in fuller detail. In essence, however, the remedial rights-only model claims that countries should only be granted secession rights if they were the victim of heavy oppression on the side of the parent country. In looking at a variety of these political commentaries, including, but not limited to, Crimea, East Timor, Western Sahara, the cases on screen, and more, I found that UN commentary was pretty inconsistent on this issue. However, what I did find to be consistent was that in every case that fit the remedial rights-only model, which is every case that I have listed on the slide, the UN did not cause recognition, but rather tolerated recognition, which in turn led to widespread recognition later as the UN admitted member states into the UN, which is a process we can actually see happening right now with Kosovo, as many domestic nations have now recognized its sovereignty despite a lack of official membership. Therefore, these political commentaries on South Sudan, Bangladesh, and Kosovo provide me with a basis to justify my policy position based on previous non-judicial precedents and the lack of an actual judicial precedent. So, what is the current UNC secession model? Well, there is none. The ICJ did intentionally avoid creating such a dominant model in the form of the remedial rights-only philosophy in adjudicating the Kosovo case, but it has seemed to tolerate remedial rights-only arguments in tolerating recognition efforts for South Sudan and Bangladesh. Due to the lack of a dominant model, the UN has a lot of room to decide what type of policy it wants to take on for separatist movements that wish to join the UN. The fact that the UN avoided completely outlawing UNC secession in Kosovo also seems to indicate, to me at least, that the UN would still wish to find some sort of way for UNC secession to be legal. Now let's talk about the remedial rights only model. What is it? The remedial rights only model posits that separatist movements may only secede as a last resort after deliberate, sustained, and systematic human rights abuses in the extreme. This model, while not dominant in international law, has been highly influential in previous UNC secession cases regardless. This model comes from scholars trying to find a model that balances the UN Charter's principles of territorial integrity and self-determination that would not leave the bar low enough for separatist movements to threaten international stability. Now, looking at all this, what would my policy be? Well, I want to implement a policy that would implement this remedial rights only model while also introducing a few additional qualifiers. This policy would call for the ICJ, upon its next case it adjudicates regarding UNC secession, to allow for separatist movements to create a new nation and petition the UN to join the general body if it sustains deliberate, sustained, and systematic human rights abuses wrought unto them by their parent country. The secessionist group must also be able to muster a UN-backed independence referendum requiring greater than 3/4 of eligible voters within that territory to actually turn out, and more than 3/4 of those voters to vote in support for referendum. This policy will also ban veto powers for the P5 in admitting new countries to the UN. They, however, may still make their will apparent in the general body vote. Why this policy? Well, it takes a lot of different things into account. It takes into account that the UN must deliver a judicial verdict on the rights of people to unilaterally secede from their parent state and form their own state, or risk falling out of line with their own self-determination principles, because if you really think about it, requiring bilateralism to create a new state is in and of itself antithetical to principles of self-determination. Additionally, colonialism is quite outdated, so if all the self-determinative philosophies of the UN only apply in colonial contexts, the ability of people to determine their own destinies is extremely, if not completely, limited. It also takes into account the UN Charter's position at the top of the international legal hierarchy, which means that Article 1, subsection 2, and Article 2, subsection 4 should therefore be equally weighed. It also takes into account that the text in Article 2, subsection 4 only calls for the territorial integrity of states to be respected by other states, not necessarily mentioning internal actors. The policy also takes into account previous political, non-judicial stances taken by the UN, such as in Chechnya, Bangladesh, South Sudan, and more, in order to create a policy that limits the level of UN hypocrisy as much as possible. It also recognizes that the P5 shouldn't have any more or less say on the recognition of a nation if the UN wants to limit its hypocrisy regarding its self-determinative principles. It also acknowledges the threats towards international stability that legalization of secession movements creates, and therefore provides a high bar for these movements to pass. It also sneakily provides a mechanic for the UN itself to, in a way, unilaterally control the recognition of countries by choosing whether or not to back a certain independence referendum, which may appease the Permanent Five while also forcing them to engage in more negotiations with UN representatives where they would hold less absolute power than, say, a veto power, which it currently holds. It also naturally forces these new states to be bound by UN law by keeping UN membership as proof of international recognition. Finally, this policy takes into account that an overwhelming amount of citizens in a secessionist territory should actually want to secede, not just a simple majority. The numbers I chose, 3/4 and 3/4, mean that mathematically a secessionist movement will not be able to create a false claim to independence that doesn't actually reflect the will of the people, such as the Crimean independence referendum manipulated by Russia. It also, on the flip side, means that a parent country won't be able to cast doubt mathematically on the will of the people in that secessionist territory by requiring 3/4 turnout and 3/4 of the people in that turnout to also support independence. Finally, it chooses eligible voters and not population because the policy recognizes that suffrage may not be universal everywhere. Now, why not a different policy position? Well, I thought that the simple remedial rights only policy would prove to be too destabilizing and controversial among the P5, especially when noting their histories. I also didn't want to plainly make UNC secession illegal because that would flagrantly fly in the face of the self-determinative principles that the UN is supposed to stand for. All in all, My policy aims to limit UN hypocrisy while falling in line with principles of territorial integrity and self-determination in order to lead to the best possible precedent for future generations and peoples. Thank you.